is a frontline union. We are the fourth.
I said you are a frontline union.
We're the fourth largest in the UK, actually, and the largest education union in Europe. And I think if we just give a background, we are quite new. And since our formation, we've worked particularly well with the Shadow Secretary of State for Education. So Angela Rayner, when she was in that position with regards to forming things like the National Education Service and going forward into the manifesto that caused that. I think I can echo so many of the things that Matt has said, you know, very different times. You've only got to look at the mess and the chaos that our government has caused in England. Because if you look at Wales and Scotland, it's a very, very different picture. And you have to ask yourself, why is it a different picture? And if I'm thinking about education, I know why it's a different picture, because right from the beginning, they had a task force that worked with government and with the education unions. So our brothers and sisters in EIS, in Scotland, and the NEU in Wales worked hand in hand with government, having conversations, thinking about what it would mean to keep schools open and to open them up wider as we're going forward. And I guess just as a background, really, the government announced in March with a few days' notice that we would have a lockdown on schools. And the NEU believe throughout all of this, we've been absolutely on the right side of history, because we pushed for schools to remain open for key worker and for vulnerable kids, and so that we could make sure that we had social distancing and the various plans that were in place for those pupils, so that actually we could do what the government first statement says, and I believe this will probably come back, save lives and protect the NHS. And I think that the fact that our members were in schools and colleges up and down the country open, they actually did that. But what the government did, and they continue to do even now, is they release statements, but with very little information, and it takes time for that information to come out. So it leaves people very much in the realms of having to do that themselves. So the NEU straight away stepped in, looked at how we keep our schools open, but we also looked at how we protected our vulnerable members, and not just our vulnerable members, but also the vulnerable people in our communities. Because, and to be honest, SAGE, which is the government advisors on science, and we've got Independent SAGE, neither of those have yet come out and said that children don't transmit the virus. They do say that they don't get it and they don't have symptoms, but they haven't said how much they transmit. So we're still waiting on so much of those details. So the lockdown happened, we quickly stepped in and began to look at what that would mean for our schools and our colleges from that point on, and what that meant for education. And it's very much a blended learning, where we've been having kids at home and kids in school learning, probably pretty much like what's been going on wherever you are in the world as well. With regards to organising, a bit like Matt, we had to change how we organise. I was in Hamilton House, which is our HQ, on the last day that it was open, on the Friday, and that was specifically to do a video, because in their statement about closing schools, they also said, well, there'll be no exams, but didn't have anything to go with that. So my video was to do towards those young people that had spent 2 years studying, training, deciding, knowing what they were doing for those exams, just to them to say, don't worry, we're as a profession know you, you will get the grades that you deserve. We will make sure that there's a process followed. And so we've been doing lots of things behind the scenes with regards to that, as well as the firefighting. So that's kind of where we started. We then looked at, okay, how do we do this? So we tried the town hall telephone calls, which had members logging in, and you had the general secretaries and I would chair it on the end of the telephone. And we quickly moved, like Matt, to Teams for our internal workings, but actually to Zoom for our membership meetings. And we kind of went along with that for a couple of weeks. And then Boris Johnson announced that all kids would be going back again on the 1st of June. And he gave a month's notice for that. And that saw over one weekend, 2,000 members join the NEU just over that weekend. We immediately, the following Tuesday, set up reps calls and branch and districts, because we're worked in the way that we have regional office structure, then we have branch and districts, and we have school and college reps that feed into those branch and districts secretaries. And we immediately put on some Zoom calls with regards to a checklist. So what we had done is wait for the government to come out with their information. I have to tell you, since lockdown on the 13th of March when that was announced, schools have had over 300 bits of advice and information and papers. And these papers are 10, 20 pages long. They come 7, 8 o'clock at night. They have been a nightmare. And just on the reopening, within the space of 4 weeks, there were 42 different documents, some around 50 pages long, many of them repetitive, but without highlighting what was new. So you'd be reading through and thinking, well, I've already read this yesterday. And it was very late. So when they're asking schools to open on the 1st, the nursery school education stuff came through on the 2nd of June. Yet they were supposed to have been open on the 1st. Many U-turns. This government has a habit, particularly with education, of floating an idea, leaking an idea, seeing what public perception is, and then U-turning on that idea or changing its mind. So that's kind of where we went. And after that initial 1st of May, the second week after that, we had a national Zoom call, and we had 20,000 NEU members on that call. When we're doing larger calls like that, we do use Zoom for members to log in, but it's in a webinar format, so just the speakers can be seen. And we use Teams as a chat, so our tech team can feed the questions into us. We've proceeded. The other day I did a call and I was quite disappointed because we only had 2,500 members on there. And then you begin to kick yourself and think, come on, get in reality. This is really good stuff for trade unionism. So we've managed, and what we've done is kind of make things really simple. So we've put out a checklist, and then in those calls the members said, okay, but we have to download it, it's 20 pages long, can you do it on technology? So we created a checklist app whereby members can access the app can do that, and then they can download that as a PDF. And those checklists are risk assessments, so they're more robust than the government. With our checklist, we have ones that run alongside. So we have ones around, politically we call our BAME members black members, because that's what was vote. TAC members have their own set of checklists to check through. Our vulnerable members, so those in our disabled categories that might well be in the government's critical categories, have their own. We also have a checklist for supply members that are going into school to run alongside those checklists, and they are risk assessments. And although we didn't stop schools opening on the 1st of June, what we did do was stem that tide of them opening without thinking. And we stemmed that tide by making sure that every school had a risk assessment that wasn't just written by management and not seen, but was written in conjunction with reps, in conjunction with members, to go from there. So it's been some really great involvement. We've had over 2,000 new reps in this time, and we've put on some 90-minute training on the basics of being a rep, conversations, negotiations, and we've made sure that our branch and districts are aware where we've got new reps. In our schools and colleges where we don't have reps, we've asked people to become COVID openers. So we've asked them to download the app and to do the app and have those conversations, giving them that chance. And we've run the most amazing Zoom calls with reps talking. There was one, and they had been a rep for 2 weeks, and they were doing stuff that our reps hadn't done for years, like had a rep for 10 years that hadn't been as active. So I think we've done a really good job there. We started out with WhatsApps as well. So I'm a branch and district secretary as well as the president of Portsmouth National Education Union, and we've got a WhatsApp with all our school reps, whereby initial start we've got officers on there, but actually the reps run it themselves. They have conversations, they say who's got this information, and it's been really, really good at feeding information in. We've also run and started some CPD on things around trauma for kids, trauma in schools, trauma in education, so that our members can have some training, because we're going to have kids in the environment that some of our kids have blossomed in this time and spent time with their families, and others have just survived, and it's been a real nightmare. We've called the government to account on every measure. One of the things that really got to me personally was their comments around the union blocking vulnerable kids going to school and vulnerable kids education. Well, I've been a teacher for 22 years and I taught reception last year. You don't teach in the NEU, you're president, but I'll be back there in September. And, my drawers have always been full of extra food. My shopping contains extra pens, pencils. Anyone in my family that gets rid of a coat that it's washed and put in the cupboard. My washing machines while round in the school holidays with PE kits. I don't need any government to tell me about vulnerable kids. And actually we say it's their fault that these kids have not had access. Over 750,000 don't have internet access. We asked and pushed for a program for laptops and for equipment to be delivered. And that has been done, but it's taken almost the whole of lockdown to do that. And it's only specific kids, and it's not college. We also push for free school meals for our kids during the holidays to keep those retained. So we fire fought, and I think we've done kind of 3 levels of things. Organising with regards to our members, with regards to making their schools safe and giving them the power to do that and giving them the tools. And power is knowledge for the union. We believe that if we give them the tools, we give them the information, we touch base with them with regards to our Zooms, then we've got lots of questions to be answered. That also helps us to develop our own policies and our own strategies. The second thing we've done is a lot of background arguing with the government. We've written a number of letters to them and forced them to release the scientific evidence as to why it was safe to open schools, forced them to think about 5 tests. So right at the beginning, we put about 5 tests, and schools should only open fully when they're safe. And that is regards to lower number of cases. That is regards to test, track and trace being up in the area. That is regards to having a policy and a strategy if there are COVID cases in the schools to what happened. And government and Public Health England have already said 2 cases in the school shuts. So we've been really successful in that. It also has been dependent on supporting and making sure our vulnerable members are protected and able to work from home where possible, unless they can make a COVID-free environment in a school, which, as you can imagine, is impossible. We've also been looking at, we asked the government for a task force. They said to us, go and do what Denmark are doing, go and do what they're doing and be as good as they are. And we spoke to Denmark, and actually, yeah, Denmark have done a good job. But how have they done a good job? The unions and the government work together. Denmark schools have been given extra funding for cleaners, extra funding for outside wash facilities. They've been given strict cleaning regimes as to how they operate, smaller bubbles. Bubbles are like where you've got a group of pupils with 1 member of staff, but they've also not made the decision up to head teachers. They've let it to local counsellors to come in and check their risk assessments, check that their PPE equipment and their safety measures are in place before they allow the school to open. A very, very different scenario. So we've been working with that. We've been working with other unions. We've also been working on a 10-point education plan, recovery plan. Labour Party talked around National Education Service in their manifesto. This government have talked about a jobs recovery plan, and we believe that an education recovery plan should be funded in exactly the same way. And that covers many, many things, but it puts our most vulnerable kids at the start of it, the most disadvantaged. It's to ask for free school meals, which I don't know whether you saw, but Marcus Ratchford joined that campaign, and that was now granted to all pupils who deserve free school meals or are entitled to them. Will get them over the summer holidays now. Interesting to know, Marcus Ratchford's stepmum is in the National Education Union, so we like to spread our wings where we can across and use those the people. But it's bad that we take a footballer to make that happen when, as professionals, we've been asking for this for many times. The other thing we've looked is our local authorities to be funded, summer holiday clubs to be funded, so that these vulnerable kids can get out and play and experience and fall in love with education as opposed to being chucked into a classroom and doing English and maths. We've looked at the need that we're going to have to acquire other public buildings, libraries, community centres if we're going to have some kind of social distancing. We've worked with Ofqual around the education and exam system. And we've absolutely worked on blended learning, because we believe when there's a second lockdown, like we've just had Leicester closed, how are those kids going to learn? We have to have some kind of blended learning element. We've also looked at child poverty and the impact of child poverty, and pushed and urged the government to make sure, and it brings into things Matt was talking about, minimum wage, 0 hours contracts to be disappeared, and making sure that people are employed and paid properly. We already had 10 years of austerity, and we know that this government will be pushing for a reason to block wages of key workers that have kept our country running, and we have to absolutely fight that as unions all together collectively. And the final thing in our 10-point plan is the change in our education system. The English education system, particularly, even worse than Wales and Scotland, is very much league tables and testing driven. And we have been pushing for that in the union forever to not be here. We've looked at all of the international studies and everyone else that seems to operate really great education systems without the need to test the kids so many times. in this time of crisis, we've not had league tables, we've not had standardized testings in primary schools, and hey, we've still survived. We've still got our kids, we're still there, we're still learning. So we're pushing for that. We've had a U-turn on baseline because this government wanted to bring in tests for 4-year-olds. The pressure that we've put on that has pushed that to stop. And basically we keep continuing. It cannot be business as usual when we return, because we need to look at the wider systems of kids' mental health and what that means for education. So I guess for us, we've learned with regards to organising, we've learned with regards to keep pushing. And the way that we've kept pushing is not to do it alone. We've involved parents. We've got an NEU counsellors network, which we've got over 2,000 registered on the NEU counsellors network. We've recently set up an NEU governors network for school governors, and we've run Zooms with regards to MPs, because we believe, doesn't matter what colour your party, it's actually your constituencies that you should be protecting at this time. And sadly, that hasn't been what all of the parties have been doing, and particularly, as Matt was saying, around the decisions that the Prime Minister has made, too late to lock down, which meant we're in lockdown for longer. And, you know, all of these things that we're now releasing and things are happening, we need to see what happens. In the science world of education, you change one variable and see what happens. You don't change 10 variables and see what happens at the same time. So it's a very difficult time. But we push for September. There's supposed to be full reopening by the looks of the government plans. There is no need to social distance in schools. We are pushing again on SAGE scientists to say, how is that safe?
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Amanda. I've learned so much, it's impossible. I'm glad you went over time, eh? Really
Sorry.
good. No, don't apologise. It's very well worth it. Okay, we'll move straight on.